Hello YouTubers, my name is Willie. Welcome to my channel. Today I have for you reaction request 196. This is Descent of Angels Part 2, which is part of Arch Warhammer's lore Horus Heresy breakdown series, where he does a breakdown on the book series, and was originally requested by CJ Falcon. So let's check this out. And 3, 2, 1, play. Dun dun. Dun dun. Dun 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 dun.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Horus Heresy lore breakdowns. This will be part 2 of a Descent of Angels, and we've just arrived at the point when the Imperium shows up.
Oh.
To be more precise,
Cool.
the first Legiones Astartes, the Dark Angels. Apparently, the Lion had even seen this moment coming in a dream, which is quite interesting. It might have something to do with the relative proximity of the Emperor. He was apparently only about 3 weeks' travel away, and so, relatively speaking, close. His psyche might have awoken something within the Lion, as he had, if not an understanding, then at the very least a vague idea of what was coming.
Nice.
And indeed, of course, it was the entire Imperium who settled down on the planet and began turning it into, well, more of the Imperium, deploying massive earth-moving engines to clear out the forests and establish massive archaeologies into which the population of Caliban would eventually be transplanted into, along with, of course, any other Imperial servants required to make sure that the planet runs smoothly. The Dark Angels, on their own side, started putting the various recruits of the orders through a test to see if they might be worthy of acceptance into the Dark Angels Legion, and also to see if the breeding stock of Caliban, in general, would be pure enough to make the world a recruiting world for the First Legion. And it was. Not only were the rather martial traditions of Caliban a perfect fit for the Astartes legions, they also had remarkably little taint, which everything we know about the place is surprising. Now, granted, again, we've been told on multiple occasions that they used to just simply, kill mutants and psychers, burning them on the pyre and such stuff, but a planet this corrupted, even though the corrupted areas are guarded by monstrous beasties and whatever the fuck those little guardians of the Cabal are, you really would expect more of an effect, wouldn't you? But whatever the reason, there was none. And hell, even the librarians of the First Legion didn't really notice anything. Nothing at all. In fact, again, they were astounded at just how clean the planet was, considering how long it had been isolated. We do also get one rather tasty little tidbit. So this was relatively early on in the Imperium's expansion. And one of the Dark Angel librarians let slip that, yes, there are more creatures like the Lion. In fact, there are 19. Which means that whatever happened to the lost Primarchs hadn't happened yet. Again, it isn't much information, but at least it's a little bit of an addition to the timeline. Whatever happened, it happened after the Emperor had discovered Lionel Johnson. And now, of course, Big E himself was heading towards Caliban to reunite with his lost son.
Nice.
There were some minor scuffles on the way, like, for example, Zahariel and Nemiel getting involved in a shadowy little underground movement, whom were not particularly fond with the changes that the coming of the Imperium had imposed upon their world. Obviously, it was changing rather rapidly, to put it mildly, and one of the many things that was to change were the Knightly Orders. Still split into dozens, if not hundreds, of different orders, they were now all disbanded and rolled in under the banner of the Order, which now took up the moniker of the First Legion. Of course,
Wow.
many of the older members could not be initiated into the Legion as proper Astartes. That honour was only for the younger members, of which I think Zahariel and Nemiel were two of the oldest at 15 or 16 at that point. But many of the more venerable members of the various orders were also rolled in as commanders and officers and given limited augmentations, enough to let them, relatively speaking, keep up with their Astartes brethren, although they would never be quite like the Astartes. They would never have quite the bulk, quite the reflexes, quite the
Yes,
strength,
but
quite
their
the speed,
experience would be
quite the
great
skill.
training for
In
the
other words, they
younger
would
ones.
forevermore be looking down at, well, those they'd consider the supplicants and find themselves wanting. You know, part of me thinks that this is really a disservice to these older warriors. Essentially, they would now constantly put in the shadow of younger men with no real way of ever getting themselves out of it again. Ask Luther how nice that feels. And of course, with these great changes also came considerable changes to Calvinite society. No longer were the nobles considered to be, well, proper nobles. Now, even the lowliest peasants could be rolled into the imperial army, or, well, volunteer, to be honest. There was no enrollment as of yet. This meant that even the lowliest of peasants could become a warrior and venture out into the galaxy, something that even the noblest of nobles is not guaranteed to be able to do. This obviously had some rather drastic effects on how these nobles now saw their own position, and there were groups on Caliban that began resisting the idea of the Imperium's further encroachment upon their traditions, upon their livelihood. After all, what manner of horrors would be spawned if the peasants were to go to war? After all, they have no idea of chivalry, they might do all kinds of creepy shit. If these poor fuckers even had the faintest inkling about how the Legiones Astartes fought, they probably wouldn't bother with this whole insurrection, but they didn't. They hadn't got a bloody clue, and so they figured they could fight the Imperium.
Huh.
It is true what they say, ignorance is indeed bliss. If these bloody little fools had the faintest inkling what they were trying to fight against, well, let's just say that they'd probably think the better of it, eh? They also decided to try and assassinate the Emperor, which...
Wow.
That's a bloody good idea, isn't it? They got Zahariel and Nemil dragged into this as well, which sucked even more. The assassination plan on the Emperor, apparently something they tried to do with a handful of frag grenades, yeah, I'm sure that would have done the bloody job, was interrupted by Zahariel. The Dark Angels, or at the time, the First Legion, were not particularly fond of this, not, the fact that he interrupted it, but the fact that anybody had bothered trying in the first place, and put Zahariel to some rather severe interrogation, and after that they wiped his memory to ensure that no trace of enmity might remain within the Legion. This was done, by the way, on the order of the Emperor himself, so clearly it was pretty goddamn important. It seems like a ticking time bomb to me, but hey, details. And Zahariel and Nemiel were both accepted into the Legion. Seems like a bad idea to include Zahariel in this, considering what they did to him, but, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? Famous last words. We also now get to hear how the Legion got its name, the Dark Angels.
Ooh.
In part, it came from Luther. When he had first seen the Legiones Astartes, he'd seen assault troops descending from the heavens on pinions of fire, that being, of course, their jump packs, and he had called them angels. This rhymed rather well with an old Calibanite legend saying that in the dark days of the beginning time, when the world was first overrun by monsters, the population were protected by mysterious armored warriors that were known as the Dark Angels. As such, it was a very fitting name for the First Legion. Although, one interesting little side note. Dark angels, mysterious creatures robed in darkness. Does that sound at all familiar, perhaps? Something about some watchers in the dark, perhaps, that also, in some way, protected the population against the great beasts by keeping them in certain areas? It certainly would be a rather delicious irony if the First Legion had taken their name from some shadowy aliens. Yet another reason for Lionel Johnson to lock himself in his room and cry, eh? Granted, the idea that the name came from the Watchers in the Dark is a mighty leap of logic, but it's not impossible. But regardless of the origins of the name, they were now finally the Dark Angels, and they were ready to venture out into the great galaxy beyond and bring the light of violence, vast quantities of vicious violence, to the ignorant aliens.
Nice.
Except not really. The Dark Angels came at a time in the Great Crusade where it had kind of hit its stride, and they were a very, very new addition to the Great Crusade. As such, most of the early days of the Dark Angels were spent in what was essentially reinforcement capacities, watching over compliant worlds and carrying out garrison duty, rather than the noble battle they had so hoped for. And this need for battle would even become a little bit of a problem. As you can probably imagine, the people of Caliban, always having been rather militaristic, they really wanted to get into a proper scrap, but on the other hand, the established forces within the Crusade wanted them to get used to things first. Get acclimatized to this new form of warfare. After all, one needs to remember, the primary goal of the Great Crusade wasn't necessarily to kill everything it came across. The primary goal was to reunite the lost strands of humanity. And the freshly minted Dark Angels, with their somewhat belligerent nature, were not best suited for this diplomatic task. The Lion's original plan for dealing with this was to take most of the fresh Dark Angels and integrate them into already existing commands within what used to be the First Legion. In other words, he'd send off a chapter's worth of troops to rejoin another chapter. The hope would then that the fresh recruits would learn from the old hands and learn perhaps a little bit of restraint as well. This didn't really work out all that much. There was quite a lot of friction within the Dark Angels Legion in the early days. One short story in the Horus Heresy, for example, details a rather considerable amount of friction between the old guard and the fresh. One of the major points of contention was the entitlement of the new legionnaires, the Calibanites. There was a very clear split between the two, those of the Legion and those of the Dark Angels. Those of the Dark Angels tended to invoke the Lion's name in everything, as if he was somehow their property before everybody else's. He was their leader, not the Legion's Primarch, and they prided themselves greatly upon their Calibanite heritage, integrating parts of their ancient heraldry into their uniforms and battle gear. To put it bluntly, the Calibanites considered themselves to be a little bit more special than the First Legion troops, and whilst in the Loyalist part of the Legion, this would eventually simmer down and the two forces would amalgamate and become stronger together, well, in the other parts, not so much. But we are getting quite ahead of ourselves. For now, the Legion began to adjust itself. The fresh recruits from Caliban, the Dark Angels, were sent out to rejoin the more veteran brothers of the First Legion and to introduce them to their own traditions and, well, introduce them to the concept of being Dark Angels, a name change that, in general, were well received by all of them. And the Lion himself took command of one expeditionary fleet, although, well, it was called an expeditionary fleet, but in reality it was a second-line formation, a reinforcement unit for the time being. The 4th Expeditionary Fleet consisted of a mere 7 vessels, with the Primarch's flagship being the largest and most powerful. This was a fairly small force for a Primarch, and one can wonder why. Some Primarchs were given great degrees of freedom when they were first discovered, others were given, well, some restrictions, shall we say, in specific missions. In the case of the Lion, I suspect the Emperor started him out with a fairly small battle group so that he could get used to cooperating with the wider Imperium. The Emperor undoubtedly noticed the fact that the Lion was a bit, shall we say, introverted. He probably wanted to ease him into the task of greater command responsibilities. Don't get me wrong, the Lion was a brilliant tactician. In fact, he might even have been better than Gilliman, but his tactical brilliance was more of a instinctual thing rather than the planned brilliance of somebody like a Gilliman. And of course, as we previously talked about, he had problems around people, let's just say. As such, it seems fairly natural to try and make his interactions with the wider Imperium and his brothers as friction-free as possible in the early days. Indeed, one of his first deployments was to a planet named Sarosh that appeared to be fully compliant. They had originally been encountered by the White Scars, and after a quick little reconnaissance, turned out that the population appeared to be more or less friendly. They welcomed the Imperium with open arms and profusely stated that they wished to join in the Great Imperium. The problem was, although they kept saying they wanted to become parts of the Imperium, they kept extending the deadline and giving new excuses, various vagaries and particularities of the current system of governments that constantly delayed the process of full integration into the Imperium. This meant that the White Scars had to hang around for an extended period of time, and, well, the White Scars do not do immobility. It gets them really, really antsy. And so they wanted to be off to rejoin the wider crusade, and luckily for them, the Lion was currently being eased into his new job, and overseeing the compliance of a world that was outwardly friendly but hesitant seemed like the perfect way of easing him into his new job. As much sense as the deployment might have made, however, the decision was met with a great deal of rancor amongst the rest of the Dark Angels. They were not particularly fond of this second-line deployment for them, the mighty Dark Angels, the orders of knights to be used for garrison duty. That didn't seem right. They wanted to be in the thick of the fight, not some glorified police force. And the reasons for this, of course, were obvious. Again, these were extremely militaristic people. They had been trained to fight from a very early age, and they'd been fighting, again, from a very early age, both against the Great Beasts and other knightly orders. They considered themselves veteran fighters and wanted to be in the thick of it. The problem was, of course, that at that point in time, the Imperium didn't necessarily only need warriors. Before the Dark Angels could be entrusted with their own full expeditionary forces, etc., independent of the previous First Legion, they needed to prove that they could operate without simply bludgeoning everything in range. They needed to learn the subtle arts of diplomacy and restraint, something the Dark Angels didn't really like. Which is understandable. Again, they came from a world where everything was trying to kill them, so you can kind of excuse their zeal, shall we say. Turns out, though, that Sarosh was going to be a very, very poor lesson in restraint. First and foremost comes the sheer infuriating nature of Sarosh. The planet had an ancient and gargantuan labyrinthian system of bureaucracy. A full 25% of the planet's population held some form of bureaucratic office.
Wow.
That meant that there were over 180 million bureaucrats on the planet, all with their own little niche, their own little job, and their own little thing to rubber stamp before the Imperium could fully declare the planet compliant. Now, anybody who's spent an evening standing in line at the DMV is going to recognize the frustration of dealing with large-scale bureaucracy. Now take that experience and increase it by, about 179 million, eh?
Nice.
Not fun. Not fun at all. It would appear that the White Scars had had the right of it, dumping their burden on the Dark Angels and running for the nearest jump point as quickly as their engines could push them. In addition to their eternal bureaucracy and general boredom, the Saroshi also had a couple interesting little habits, like wearing masks at all times of the day, except in their most intimate of moments they always wore masks, even in their dealings with the Imperium. This had made the White Scars distrust them, Who knows why? It's not like somebody who has to hide his face at all times might have something to hide or anything. Details. And indeed, the secret the Saroshi was hiding was, well, quite a goddamn big one, as the Dark Angels would quickly find out. During their welcoming ceremony, the Saroshi sent a delegation aboard an ancient spacecraft, a practically museum piece that caught the interest of Zahariel and Luther. Luther apparently had an interest in these ancient machines, as he noted that you needed a certain love for these old things to truly appreciate their real value. He also noticed something else that had him somewhat on his toes, and he ordered Zahariel to leave the embarkation deck and go off and find himself something else to do in the meantime. Just, shoo-shoo, basically. Zahariel felt this was a bit odd, and whilst he, to begin with, obeyed the instructions, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong indeed, and after a short while, returned to the embarkation deck, where he discovered that the Saroshi shuttle had a massive nuclear warhead built into it. Shortly thereafter, Luther also showed up and kind of went, well, I mean, yes, I did notice, but, I thought maybe I could blow up the lion and wouldn't that be cool? I could be the actual leader for once. Which, makes sense. I mean, I don't blame him. If it weren't for the lion, Luther would be the greatest man of his age. Hell, possibly one of the greatest men in the history of Caliban. And yet, here's the lion. A presence that outshines him to such a ludicrous goddamn degree that I can excuse Luther for his momentary weakness. Especially considering he came right back and went, well, I mean, yeah, that was a stupid idea. Thought about it for a second. I'm back now to try and fix it. And fix it they did, to, well, at least some extent. Zahariel, quick thinking as always, decided to void the entire bay into space, evicting the offending warhead out into the cold void, where it exploded relatively harmlessly, only taking with it a few dozen meters of the armor plating of the ship, rather than burying its little ass right into the middle of said ship and detonating its warhead there, probably killing the lion and quite possibly destroying the entire ship in the bargain. I also quite like the detonation device for this thing. So, the Saroshi delegate that had come aboard the ship was a particularly fat little man who decided that he should start insulting the lion and his various officers. One might even think that the fat little man had a death wish. And apparently the lion thought as well and decided to help him out by relieving him of his head.
Nice.
Unfortunately, the Saroshi delegate had a death wish, as he had wired the nuclear warhead to his life signs. And when they so abruptly stopped because the lion had relieved him of a few extra kilograms, one of the best and quickest diets on the market, if you must know, the Saroshi shuttle began lifting off from the deck, preparing to launch itself into the heart of the ship, after which it would in all due likelihood detonate the warhead, which would have gone very, very badly for everybody involved if it weren't for Zahariel's quick reaction. Now, at least one problem has been solved, that being the problem about Saroshi's compliance. They were not compliant. And so, next step would be to turn the entire planet into a radioactive ball of glass.
Wow.
But, unfortunately, once again, the Saroshi didn't do this completely without some planning. This wasn't some kind of pointless show of resistance. You see, the Saroshi turned out to be a rather religious sort, but the Imperial surveys had not noticed this. Apparently, the Saroshi kept their temples out in the wildernesses and underground and such things, and so forth. The Imperials hadn't realized that they were a religious sort. The problem was the exact nature of their religion. Highly chaotical. Very, very much so. And they were planning to summon one of their angels to defend them. One of their Nephilim. Which is a rather interesting choice of words. Now, the Nephilim have quite a lot of myths connected to that particular name, but probably the most accurate in this case would be fallen angels, those who rebelled against God. Although, well, in this particular instance, they probably didn't so much rebel against their gods as they were simply just really, really, really mean creatures. And considering the thing that they were trying to resurrect actually posed a threat to the lion, whilst only being able to manifest a tiny portion of its power, it was undoubtedly a fairly nasty little critter. They did eventually manage to stop the resurrection, summoning, I don't really know what term to use for this thingity-bob, but they managed to stop it before it was fully summoned using an experimental weapon that they called a psychic warhead, apparently a pet project of one of the Dark Angel's librarians. Rather interesting little weapon. The Imperium could have used more of those, I'm thinking. It was a bit late, though. Most of the Imperial delegates and citizens on the planet had been murdered in mass ritualistic sacrifices. Because of course they had. One particularly unfortunate young woman was chosen to be the host of this monstrous thingity-bob, and if it wasn't, again, for Zahariel, her immortal soul would have been particularly sad about her particular fate. With the destruction of the demon, though, pretty much all forms of resistance on Sarash collapsed. They had given up all hope now that their god was killed, and they kind of just rolled over and let themselves get fucked into oblivion. Now, obviously, this meant that the planet was not compliant, and not compliant in the worst possible way. The Dark Angels launched a few skirmishes here and there, and they called in Imperial army elements, along with forces from the Fire Wasp's Titan Legion, to finish cleaning the planet up. But, far more importantly, the Dark Angels were about to have their own little moment of drama. Zahariel, Luther, and hundreds of other Dark Angels were sent back to Caliban. It would appear that Luther, in his infinite wisdom, had decided to tell the lion about his little indiscretion. I don't know if that was an entirely good idea. The Luther knows the lion pretty well, and he knows that his social skills are somewhat lacking. Regardless, I do find it to be a little bit of an overreaction from the lion to just go like, well, you had a moment of doubt, fuck you for all eternity, and go away. Seems a bit much, to be honest. Granted, he was planning on letting the Soroshi delegate blow the lion into many, many, many tiny pieces scattered throughout the cosmos, but, you know, live and let live and all that. In all due likelihood, I think there's a different reason for why the lion was so harsh with Luther. I think Luther was a very real reminder to the lion of how he couldn't read people. I think it was a personal blow to his ego. He obviously thought that he could trust Luther. He considered Luther to be his brother, almost like a father figure, in fact. And now he realized that that trust had been, for however short of a period of time, betrayed, which again calls into question his ability to judge people. We'll see this in later books. The lion really starts doubting himself, doubting his ability to read people. And it is very clear that this thing with Luther shook him to his very core. So you might even say that him banishing Luther was a form of self-defense mechanism, where the lion simply decided to shut himself off from the trauma and avoid dealing with these various feelings and problems in his psyche, and how he had so horribly misjudged someone. And of course, after that point, every time he would lay eyes on Luther, he would be reminded of this, of his very personal and monumental failure. And at this point, I think we all know that Primarchs are not particularly fond of failure.
Not by
They're even
any
less
means.
fond of being reminded of their failure. And so this is where we leave both Zahariel and Luther and several members of the Legion as they are heading back to Caliban to train new recruits. In fact, it only took the Lion 6 hours after returning to his ship to decide to send them away. And Zahariel's inclusion in all of this might seem odd at first, but clearly, Luther also told the Lion about Zahariel's involvement, and the Lion undoubtedly was not very fond of the fact that Zahariel hadn't simply come directly to him to tell him about Luther's actions. It might also have been in part due to Zahariel's actions down on Sorosh, where he had been instrumental in defeating the demonic entity, and with the Lion's pride ruffled as it already was, it was most definitively not the correct time to steal the Lion's thunder. And now, all the way at the end, let's talk a little bit about the book in general. So, Descent of Angels. I mentioned to begin with that I almost feared doing this one because I really disliked the book the first time I read it. Rereading it, it feels a lot better. Once I know what to expect, it's a lot easier to like it. It's quite lacking in the action department. In fact, it's downright boring at certain points, to be honest. But it does give a lot of really good and interesting information about the Dark Angels and about the Lion's personality. I feel
Or
maybe that the
personality
dismissal of
defect.
Luther was a bit undercooked. I'm hoping we'll get a little bit more meat on that further down the line, because while we can speculate as to his reasons, it still seems like a rather abrupt break to their relationship. But all in all, it's not nearly as bad of a book as I thought the first time I'd read it. The pacing, as I mentioned, is a bit off, but the sheer volume of information and the fairly interesting information about the lion, etc., does make up for it. Plus, I do like the Soroshi. I really like the writer's take on them, their kind of masked naivete, how they wonder about imperial words in Gothic, for example, how they can't quite express themselves. They take very innocent sounding words and they make them sound far more horrible in the context that they are used. And it really makes me wonder, like, how horrible are these creatures really? We know that they basically ritualistically sacrifice 8% of their population, millions of people, and the way
Wow.
they speak, it feels like they're hiding a very, very malicious kind of attitude behind a veil of naive misunderstanding. It's really cool. Anyways, that's enough for now. I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening.
Well,
And I
thank
hope
you,
to see you
Arch.
all again soon with the next part of the Horus Heresy lore breakdown. That being, of course, Legion, which is a pretty goddamn cool book because it deals with the Alpha Legion, the coolest of all the Legionis Astartes, and whilst the final conclusion of said book is a little bit out there, it's still a pretty damn good one. So, until then, have a good day.
You too, Arch. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun. All right. Well, so let's talk about what I learned in this. Apparently, when the second part started, it was right when the first Legion was coming down, and they began the terraforming of the planet, tearing down the concept of the nobles. And this brought a lot of dangerous thoughts and feelings, so they attempted to assassinate the Emperor, and that was no good. No good. They became Dark Angels, named after a legend on the planet of said Dark Angels coming down to defend them. And this eventually having these new Astarte recruits, these Dark Angels, joining in with the First Legion as an attempt to get them used to the concept, caused a lot of friction. And they definitely did not want to be on garrison duty. They found themselves too proud for that. They wanted to fight. They eventually got sent to a planet. Oh, shoot. Surridge. On on that planet, they found that it was bureaucratic and that they always wore masks. They eventually came on an ancient spacecraft to talk to him and had a nuclear warhead on board, which ended up getting dumped. But not after Luther had shown signs of a bit of a betrayal. But this was a clear sign that they weren't friendly at all, so they came in and they started wiping out this planet, which had been essentially chaos worshippers. But once they destroyed, it kept the demon from being summoned. Their fallen angel summoned. It collapsed and they just took the planet. Luther's potential betrayal is noticed by the Lion, and he ends up getting banned. That's pretty much where we end up with this part. Very interesting learning about the Lion. It'd be neat to see more of that and see where that goes in this series or any lore at all. He seems like with social issues, a real interesting character. But I think for now, I'm going to leave it at that. So, this was a reaction to Arch Warhammer's Descent of Angels Part 2. There's a link in the description to help you find Arch Warhammer's stuff. There's tons of lore videos, handful of gaming videos. You should go and support them. This was originally requested by CJ Falcon. Thank you for requesting that. Very interesting stuff. Very interesting stuff. So, till next time, Willie, out.
If you liked the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to leave a comment. Have a good one.
Let us